Well, good morning, everybody. You know, if you want something done right, my wife always says, put me in charge. You may have remembered I sent an email out to everyone dated April 16th, talking about the readings that Parvez had sent to me. And then I sent another email about 5 minutes later saying, well, I had that date wrong, trust me. Except I didn't send that to Parvez. So when I talked to him a few minutes ago and said, where are you? You can imagine what he said. So we're going to talk, he's coming next week. Hold your questions about diversity and democracy at UNF until Parvez is with us. We're going to do something today that is similar to about 6 of you here who are present at the beginning of current events, and talk a little bit about what's current. In that first couple of meetings, if I remember right, Jeannie Kaplan, you were part of that group. You or Sheila or someone would bring a newspaper clipping and say, this is current. So what I'd like to do this morning is not so much call on you to show us your newspaper clippings, but open the conversation to suggestions about current issues. I can throw out a couple of ideas, but nobody here is interested in that case. Phoebe. What, the turning off the water supply at the Henley? I don't know that that's as current.
We've got a big, what do you call those ponds where you have, the chemicals in these ponds.
Oh, the wastewater pond
And now they're
in South
releasing
Florida.
it into the Tampa Bay,
Yeah.
and it's going to be an algae bloom, and nobody's going to be able to swim. Look about the economy, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is happening all over the country. So what are we going to do about water?
Well, there's some topics there, and some. It's never necessary to be true, by the way, to talk about it here. That was a joke. I used to be in the coal business, as I've said many times, and we had this constant problem of what to do, how to dispose of refuse. Power plants that burn coal have the same problem. And we'd always deposit the refuse somewhere and build a dike around that somewhere, line the dike, such that the water that collected, the rainwater or other forms of water collected over that refuse didn't leak into the streams or into the water supply. And we were constantly accused of allowing our retaining walls or the reservoirs to leak coal water into the water supply. Precisely the same thing is happening now with the wastewater in Palmetto. Is that the name of the town in Florida where that's happening? Does anybody know this case? Palmetto. I have no doubt that there's truth in that. I think we see pictures of some of the water leaking out one corner, the thing just pouring out because it's a large quantity of water that's held by the reservoirs behind it. And nor do I have a doubt that there are numerous examples of reservoirs who are testing the limits, the lifetime limits of their linings. There's just no question about that. I don't know what any of you think about, and there are several here who've been in business, and Doug, I don't know if the trucking industry had similar kinds of issues, but I think the category I'd put that under is infrastructure. Things we build for good purposes, whether they're bridges or roads or dams or reservoirs, have lifetimes. And all engineers say the life expectancy of this particular solution is X. Well, X has come for many things in our infrastructure, whether it be a bridge or a road, a dam, or whatever else. And the solution, of course, I guess, is to is to start one by one solving those problems, updating the equipment. Doug, is there something similar to this? Does that resonate with you in your industry? Ken? Thank you.
Yes. In our case, a couple of situations. One would be fuel. Many of our terminals would have fueling capabilities. And really, I think the solution there is the fuel tank is contained in a separate walled container. So that if for some chance the tank was to leak, there's another kind of a double wall.
Concrete wall?
Well, yes, to cover it. For lower volume terminals, we would not have our in-house fueling. What we could do is pay an outside vendor come in at night with a tanker truck and basically, drive around the yard, filling up each individual vehicle. So that would be one of the cases with respect to fuel. With respect to water, the big risk with water would be wash racks, where you're basically washing the debris and so forth that accumulates on a tractor trailer off. We did have a case in North Carolina, Kernersville, North Carolina, where we were accused of depositing arsenic in our wastewater. And we thought we had all the soaps and detergents and all that all covered. We retested them and couldn't find where the arsenic was coming from. In fact, where the arsenic was coming from, it was very, very low level, but was from the public water supply coming into the wash rack. So these are, so I guess on the one hand you have extreme regulation. On the other hand, I think you have to engineer for the assumption of eventual failure. So you have a kind of like a double-walled system. Or if you do not, if you complain, well, that costs too much, well, then you can't do it. You've got to have somebody else who's willing to put the investment in for the safe fuel storage to do it for you.
How many of you are familiar with the concept of pricing various products at a level that includes the reclamation cost, either of the product itself or the process of making that product? So that there would be in the cost of a gallon of diesel, for example, the price to reclaim all those old fuel facilities or fueling facilities that eventually, at some point in the lifetime of the Earth, would have to be reclaimed. There are several instances of that in the case that, again, I keep reverting back to coal. Reclaiming coal mines is not a cost that coal miners reclaim or are able to capture when they sell the coal. You sell the coal at just pennies over the cost to produce it. Then, 50 years later, when the mine is abandoned, whether it be a surface mine or a deep mine, the reclamation cost just sits out there. And in many instances, coal companies just walked away, leaving that cost as a public cost, part of infrastructure. The cost of maintaining our roads and bridges, I think, was meant to be part of the cost of gasoline, wasn't it? Wasn't there a gasoline tax theoretically sufficient to maintain the roads in good repair? Where does that money go? Does anybody know other than the trucker who knows everything? But I think it's worthwhile asking again.
It goes into the Highway Trust Fund.
Okay, it goes to the highway. And is the Highway Trust Fund the only fund available to maintain roads?
No, that would not be sufficient. It's only 18 point something cents a gallon, and it's not enough to do all that. And actually the truckers pay a disproportionate amount of that tax on my end.
So that could lead us perhaps to another current discussion, which is the infrastructure proposal that Biden has made. He wants to have it wind its way through Congress by the end of the summer. And of course, in that infrastructure, Biden has included not only hard cost expenditures, roads and bridges and the like, but also schools and health facilities and educational activities that are human costs that need to be incurred to beef up our human infrastructure. I suspect some of you would take the view that the proposed cost of that infrastructure is high. Or stated differently, that the tax proposals necessary to offset that cost would lead to taxes that you might think are high. Or some of you might not think any of those things. There are numerous possibilities. Let's start with the high cost. I want to say that of the 2.4 trillion, I forget now what the total amount is of the infrastructure bill, roughly half, maybe not even quite half, is roads and bridges. So you're still looking at $600 or $700 billion. Does somebody have current data on that in their minds that you carry around? Usually Bobby West holds the data for.
We have internet on the.
I actually have internet right here. Well, I'm Googling that, which is not fair when you're on the stage.
Spreading the internet to the.
Oh, that's, yeah, expanding broadband to other people. The bottom line, though, is that there isn't enough money in that $2.5 trillion package to really put our infrastructure in the condition it needs to be in for this country to be productive. Nor is there enough. The idea is an 8-year spend, a 15-year pay. In other words, we'll spend the money in that proposal over 8 years and pay taxes over 15 years sufficient to cover that 8-year expenditure. Well, think that through for a while. First of all, particularly focus on the idea that during the 8 years of spending, we're not going to be spending enough to solve the problem. And that during the 15 years of paying, there are numerous opportunities for there to be changes in government who will roll back taxes and thus not pay even that share. To me, there are several issues here we could talk about. First of all, are there any other methods to pay for infrastructure maintenance? Should we increase the gas tax?
Yeah.
Thanks, Tom.
I think the problem is getting people to realize what they're getting for their taxes and getting them to willingly pay their taxes because they know they're getting good value for it. And nobody's come up with a solution to that problem. It seems that everybody wants to lower their taxes and let somebody else pay. We've got to get people to realize that they have to pay. They're getting good value for the money that they're paying in taxes.
I read something this morning. You all know the New York Times editorialist, or I guess it's more than that, Ezra Klein. He has a podcast that a lot of people like to listen to. I read, and it sticks in my mind as I read this, with the $2 trillion American Jobs Plan, which is the infrastructure plan, the economic theory that is Bidenomics is taking shape. It's big. It puts climate at the center of everything. It's more worried about political risks, losing the House or giving Donald Trump a path back to power, than some traditional economic risks, like wasting money or bumping up inflation. And here's the line that sticks to my mind. It prefers to err on the side of spending more and making sure people know they got a bridge or a job than doing less and having people question whether government is rigging for them. It's an interesting statement. The more you do, the more likely that potholes get filled. But the less you do, the less taxes there'll be, the less costs there'll be incurred, the more likely people will say, well, government isn't working anyway. I'm curious, there are a couple of people, I don't see some of my favorites here today, but Ken, you've been known to have an opinion or two. What do you think about that level of infrastructure spending?
Well, I think Biden gets credit for bringing the whole subject to the forefront. But if it's $600 billion for actual infrastructure, and then maybe the extra for the internet, I think that's $400 billion, not sure. But those two, if you focus more on that and increase that to levels that maybe it should be. I don't know I didn't understand what you said before, that it should be a lot more money. But if the infrastructure should be even more than $600 billion, focus on that instead of adding in all the other things that have nothing to do directly with infrastructure. And maybe that would, he got more than what he wanted. He got what he wanted for the first bill on the COVID relief. Or he didn't call it that.
But adding a lot of things that weren't
A
COVID.
lot of things that are not COVID, and he's doing the same thing again. A separate subject, but Senator Manchin said he's not going to support any change in the filibuster rules. That's a side issue.
No, it's an important side issue. We'll come back to that.
So
Not whether it's even possible to
I
do
would
it.
think, if in fact infrastructure costs more than $600 billion, pay more for it, and as John said, get the benefit of the dollars that you're spending. One thing to his comment is, it's pretty well documented, I believe, that there's a hell of a lot of waste in government. I think we all know that. And maybe whatever those waste items are, that would help us feel better about paying taxes. But in any case, I think I said enough.
Well, first of all, I think the topic of what's the code word, waste, fraud, and corruption is important and needs to be addressed personally, whether that be in government spending or military spending or private spending, or for many of us, our personal spending. I wish I had all the waste, fraud, and corruption in my lifetime back again, and I'd not take that trip. Sue?
Well, I think everything might be a moot question unless the Senate can figure out how they can pass anything without getting rid of the filibuster.
Yeah. I'd like to just take a minute to introduce our guest we have today, whose opinion on all of these subjects is very important. Trina Metterath, who is the Executive Director of the World Affairs Council. Would you stand, Trina, so people can see that you're here? Yes. She does a fabulous job. So, okay, what's the answer? How do we know we're getting what we want to get with the expenditures that are made? B, how do we pay for it? And C, how in the world do we think any of this is going to get through the Senate? In 5 seconds.
I wish I had those answers, but I do want to say thank you all so very much. Vickers Landing has supported the work of the World Affairs Council, and seeing the curiosity and the level of discussion today, and knowing that our programs are coming on in here and that you all are making that possible, I just want to say thank you. It's such a treat for me to be here with you today. And I'm looking at learning the answers from you all today, so thank you. And thank you, Bob, for inviting me.
What are you doing after the meeting?
But thank you all so very much.
And well, you're welcome to come back anytime. So let's go back. We've got 3 or 4 issues on the table. Don?
I'm coming, John. Come on, move.
I want some runners.
It seems to me that we have a fundamental problem here that we haven't addressed. Planning. Joe Biden comes in and he gets this big program that should have been funded, should have been dealt with, or recognized and dealt with over the last 10 or 15 years. On an ongoing basis, it seems to me that we ought to have, the government should have, an independent group of some sort that studies this thing on an ongoing basis, and every year or every 2 years adds what's new and takes off what's been dealt with. But it is, as it is, nothing happens until there's a big crash. And then they want to spend $4 trillions of dollars to solve a problem that just didn't show up today or tomorrow or yesterday. It showed up over the past 20 years. So why, to solve the problem, it seems to me the government needs to organize as a business would, I hope, to plan, to see what's going on and plan accordingly on a long-term basis, so that the effect of a tax increase might be there, but it's spread over a period of time, rather than what it hit everybody at once with a big chunk.
You know, we complain many times, Don, it was a very good point. We complain about regulations all the time. Any of us who have been involved in business. I want to just touch on one part of regulation that speaks directly to what you're saying. Whenever you whenever you get a permit for most activities today, not all of them, sadly, but for most activities, most industrial activities particularly, in the cost that you assert is the cost of this thing you're going to do, must be included a plan for end-of-life reclamation or disposition, and the cost for paying that. You have to do all this work in the way of planning in advance. Now, is it sufficient? Clearly not always. Is the cost captured in the price of the product? No. But the regulations are clear that we're supposed to do this planning in advance. And yet we in business so often react against those regulations and say, oh, don't bother me with this pesky stuff. Not going to happen for 50 years. Good chance a lot of the people in this room won't be here in 50 years. Not much, but some. There was a hand up back here. But you understand, in other words, what you're saying is just obviously true. Business and government must plan for the future known. We know this thing will happen. There are the known knowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns, as the Secretary of Defense used to say. But we know at the end of life this thing has to be disposed of sensibly and things restored to their original condition. And we know that it will cost a certain amount of money. We know there'll be inflation. We can build those inflation costs into the estimate for disposition at the end of life, but we don't do it.
But just in addition to that, you have the situation seems to be where the solutions to some of these problems could occur long before the end of life. So you could start dealing with the problem 15 years, if it's a 20-year problem, 15 years you start implementing a solution, which could be more cost-effective than waiting until it's a crash.
Right. Going back to Phoebe's original question, the end of life isn't when the dam breaks. You know, that's not, whoops, it's time to fix the dam. We just lost a village. No, the reclamation is an ongoing process, but again, it costs money. And if it's a public activity, if it's a road or a bridge or a school, and I'm going to come back to something Ken said earlier about the composition of Biden's plan, those costs can only be recovered through either a charge for the activity or the function, or a tax, one of the two. And if we're not prepared to pay the charges for pay today for costs we know we'll incur then we have to be prepared to pay the taxes. One of the things Ken said, and I have to say I fundamentally agree that we should call infrastructure and not confuse that with improved child care. Give me a break. You know, they're just not the same. But I do believe there's a validity to the concept of hard costs and soft costs, and both have tremendous infrastructural value. I think the state of our education system isn't just the quality of the roofing of our schools. It's the quality of parental involvement, and it's the quality of teacher training and classroom size, a whole series of soft costs associated with education. I suspect there are teachers here far better qualified than I to talk about that. But the idea that that's not infrastructure, maybe let's use the wrong word, that's not a fundamentally important cost. It's a harder cost to raise money to pay than hard infrastructure, bridges and roads, although we're proving we can't do a very good job of that either. The problem is, People don't like to pay for the things that they need. It's just as simple as that. None of us do. We like to pay for the things we want, but it's hard to get us to pay for the things we need, especially if those things aren't directly used by us or solely used by us. Paying for a road that'll be used by jillions of people is hard to do. Doug?
I think in looking at this infrastructure bill, there's two very foundational issues that are not being addressed ahead of time. Number one, the plan has been developed by one party that has the slimmest of majorities, including, slimmest of majorities. And normally, let's say in a corporate setting, if you had half the board saying, we don't want to do this, it would never go forward. So that's the number one, is if you want to have a broad-based program, you need to have broad-based support, which at the moment does not exist. The second foundational question is economics. The new economics of Biden is really an extrapolation of probably John Maynard Keynes' theory from decades ago. But with this amount of additional money being created using his traditional economic analysis is going to result in inflation. And if you read the paper today, you have all kinds of people reporting of price increases. They've got to increase prices because their costs are going up. They're increasing wages. They can't find people. So inflation is bubbling there. If anyone is looking at the securities markets, I think that inflation is already evident there. So I think the economic risk of this plan, setting aside the good intentions of what it's supposed to be doing, is risky. And I think that alone scares some people.
There's 3 or 4 things in what Doug said I think need to be unpacked carefully. Let's just deal first of all with this notion, which it's hard to question, that having both parties supporting our actions makes for a better world or more sensible action. We are so polarized in this country, it's hard for me to imagine. We don't have agreement right now between the two parties on what happened January 6th. We got videotape. And there are people who say those were mostly Sunday school teachers and librarians, all Americans. We can't agree on very much of anything, and particularly, I think that polarization, somehow when you concentrate our 350 million people into the 535 people in Congress, it's like concentrating a sauce for dinner. You have such a pungent thing left over. So every bit of disagreement that you imagine is compressed into this total disagreement there. It is impossible for me to imagine that 100% of the Republicans were right on this and 100% of the Democrats were wrong, or vice versa. Nothing is that clear cut. And yet, consistently for the last 15 years, beginning at least with Obama, we've had measure after measure after measure be 100% one way or the other. How can that be on these complicated issues? And that's just our partisan polarization. I certainly don't have any answers to it. But I do think, I agree with you. For Biden to say things like, I want to have buy-in from the Republicans, I'll invite 10 of them to the White House, and then the next day say, I've done that, so we're going to go ahead with 100% Democratic votes. It's just not right. Ken?
I think there would be agreement on just the infrastructure portion of this plan, both Republican and Democrat. At $680 billion, I think there would be agreement.
First of all, I think there is agreement, but I'm not so sure that agreement will find its way into the voting, especially when you add in the pay for. There can be agreement on everybody's part that we've got to fix that bridge that just collapsed. But as soon as we introduce the concept of who's going to pay for it, that disagreement starts to fade away. Look at how much agreement there was on immigration. It wasn't very long ago that McCain-Feingold, was that immigration or was that? That was finance. finance.
on financing elections.
But on numerous, but on numerous issues, for years, there were prominent Republicans, prominent Democrats co-sponsoring legislation. But when's the last time you saw that? And when's the last time you saw anybody vote for those things that were once bipartisan measures? And I don't know the answer to that, but it seems to me it's not just the Republicans at fault. It's not just the Democrats at fault. It's something in our current political makeup. I happen to believe, and I think you've said that before, I'll let you go ahead, John.
What seems to drive all of the decisions is what's going to get me reelected. All right, we got term limits on the president, but we need term limits on senators and House representatives. And so it can constant change. Because it's just driving the whole thing. That's why you get this separation. What's going to get me reelected? And it's a shame.
I generally speaking agree with the term limits idea. The problem is, I look at my own career, how long it took me to find a men's room in each of the companies I worked for. And the idea that you take something as complicated as our government and the process of doing the right thing, anticipating in advance the problems that will come up decades down the road, and then paying for those things. And I've only got 2 terms to figure that all out. What will end up, if we do that, is you'll have a decision-making body and then a professional core of government workers. Some people call that the deep state. There are problems there. Clearly, to me, H.R. 1 starts to look more attractive when I think about this. Some of the provisions of that election reform, ending gerrymandering, which will force more competition for office, trying to limit the amount of money that's in politics, which is a big part of the problem of everybody facing re-election. As we all know, the first day in a congressman's life, they're meant to spend 4 hours on the phone raising money. First day. And they do that every day for as long as they're in Congress. Just think about that. And sadly, the people that raise the money from are some of the same people, some of you in this room, on both sides of the political spectrum. As soon as you make one political contribution, you're asked again for the rest of your life. Anyway, so that's a terribly important issue. John, did you raise your hand? Nobody scratch your nose, because you're going to get called on. Oh, good. Hey, thanks, Tim.
One aspect that has not been brought up this morning is the dozens and dozens and dozens of companies that have not paid taxes for years and years and years. Our government has permitted tax avoidance over and over again. There are 40 or 50 major corporations, from what I read, that haven't paid any taxes for a long time. And it goes on and on and on. Some effort has to be bipartisan to approach this issue and make those companies pay their legitimate share of taxes. Who knows how much might come out of that effort? And both parties have contributed to the situation we're in.
It's totally valid. I mean, the problem with current events is that every single one of them is both current and terribly important, but also complicated. I mean, I spent a long time trying to argue that corporate taxes were unnecessary. Let's tax the owner, the shareholder, not the corporation. Just pass the taxes right through. That would make it, and tax properly the ultimate shareholder by taxing the corporation on their profits and then taxing the shareholder on the dividends that he receives from those profits. It's self-taxation. And I don't know how many of the rest of you have ever argued that position. By show of hands, or not. Thanks, Doug. At least one of you here. And I really argued long and hard, let's tax as much as we need to, but tax each of us once, not double dip along the way. It's just a more sensible way to raise the money. On the other hand, corporations have ways of hanging on to that cash and not paying taxes nor distributing their profits and dividends such that you're not taxing it at all. I mean, and I know that there are smarter tax people here than I. Explain how we try to get around that. Again, they're probably very smart, good people trying to solve this problem. But they're equally smart, not so good people trying to figure out, in fact, all of us in the corporate world paid for it. We had lawyers up the gazoo whose sole job was to limit our taxes, whether they were state taxes or property taxes or federal taxes. I don't know how many of the rest of you were in business and had the same systems, but I'm assuming most of you did. Most corporations do. The paid for is a big part of it. The mix of activities. What are the things that are bipartisan in terms of preference that people want to do? Do we all agree on better roads? Or do we all agree on better schools? Do we all agree on pre-school education? Do we all agree on child care for women who want to work? Or men who want to work if there were equality? Do we all agree on equal pay for men and women for the same job? And none of those issues, by the way, is just made up. Those are all current issues that are before us today, either in Congress or in state legislatures, wherever. Phoebe?
I think another reason why we have such polarization now is the infectious, untrue things that happen on the internet, like Facebook and Twitter and everything else gets shared, and it's like a virus that just spreads. And there is a limit to free speech. You cannot stand up in a crowded movie house and yell, "Fire!" and everybody stampedes.
So
That's
maybe-
not allowed. So there are limits to how much you should be able to spread.
Another element of infrastructure might be to remove broadband for most of the population.
No. You need the internet for learning things and communicating. I'm not saying stop that.
No, I agree.
You
To
have
me,
vaccines for COVID-19, so that's what we need is a vaccine for misinformation.
again, that's a partisan thing. I often say we got a vaccine for misinformation among my fellow partisans, it would be good, but equally true for the other side, whichever side that happens to be. Now, Doug, you had something? No, I'm sorry, behind you.
You know, I'm not sure I agree with you on schools. I think that's a state function, and to get the feds into it just further complicates the issue. So I wouldn't vote for that. I would say get a true infrastructure plan. I think you would get bipartisan buy-in and approval. But he's clouded this whole plan up with this other stuff. And I don't know that they're even going to get a plan when they get through it.
Yeah. Well, I completely agree with you. I want to come back to the education thing for a host of reasons. I completely agree that identifying things clearly and limiting these programs to each of those individual things makes a lot of sense. To try to throw in all the little ideas you've had along the way and call it infrastructure because there's some bipartisan interest in infrastructure is misleading, if not wrong. On the question of education, I grew up in Idaho, and at the time I was growing up, we fought vigorously with Mississippi on which state had the worst education. And one of the debate topics that we had in high school was federal aid to education. This was in the 50s. And there wasn't, at the time, not yet a significant amount of federal aid. And the big argument was, don't let the federal government into our education pants. It's not right, it's a state thing. And I kept saying, you don't live in Idaho, where we don't have sufficient resources to educate as well as people in other states did. And why is it that just whether I'm on the Utah side of the line or the Idaho side of the line, I have a better or a different educational level? That's the value of that line. At the same time, I like the idea of having schools pretty close to the people who pay for them. In other words, the idea of local schools being paid for locally and taught locally. There's argument on both sides. But I do see a federal levelization role in education to make sure that everybody in the country has some kind of equal access to it. Does that make sense or not? But separate that from hard infrastructure and discuss it, debate it separately. Does that make any sense?
I hear you.
And the other thing, I'll go further than that. One of the laments I have about education is that we pay for it with property taxes, which makes some sense, I suppose, although I'm not sure exactly what that is. What it does mean is wealthier neighborhoods have better schools. Full stop. Whether that means they have better structures, more books, more after-school activities, or better teachers, or all the above. The evidence is pretty clear. And that's not because anybody wanted it to be so, it's that the property taxes, that the property values in those neighborhoods with poor schools happen to be lower than the property values in the better neighborhoods. And I don't know that...
That's not the case, though.
I'm sorry?
That's not necessarily the case.
I think you mentioned this once before, that in certain counties it's equalized. Can we have the mic up here, Fred?
Well, I was just pointing out that the taxes to a city or a county who runs the schools go into one pot.
Yeah.
It's not where the taxes come from, it's the influence of the wealthier people who divert the larger portion of the taxes to their schools.
Exactly.
And neglect the poor schools in the ghettos.
And that's exactly true. But any measures that try to identify those inequities and inequalities, I intuitively think we ought to look hard at, whether it be to federalize some of the activities or broaden the spread or I don't know. But somehow it doesn't seem right to me that I heard yesterday that who owns, well, I can't remember either the name of the company or the guy, so I'm not going to fool with it. But $200 billion in the hands of Jeff Bezos. The average spending per year for people in the world in the lower classes, $2 a day. I'm sorry, the average spending is $2 a day. Jeff Bezos makes $100 million a day. Just think about that. Now, I'm not sure that the solution to that problem is for them both to read from the same first grade book. But I am saying that that's a huge inequity and something ought to be done about that. Other current topics today, Prince Philip died.
No. Really?
Yes.
For some of you here who were already in grade school when Prince Philip was born, you probably just think of that as inappropriate living styles or something. But I think it's an interesting footnote to today's current events. Anything else anybody have for currents? Have we exhausted that? Doug?
I'm not intending to defend Jeff Bezos, but the fact is, in the last year, Jeff Bezos, Amazon, has hired 500,000 new employees. So that we can criticize on the one hand, but there's 500,000 people working for Amazon today as new employees that were not there a year ago.
And in Bessemer, I think they've decided not to form a union in an Amazon facility. Did you see that?
I saw that the account was going in that direction.
And the fact that Bezos pays significantly more than you used to. I think he's over $50 an hour in that facility and has other good benefits. Those are the same arguments I use for always doing things on a non-union basis. I still like the idea of unions. I think it's absolutely important to recognize that the contributions made by some people to our economy and our system of government far exceed that from others, and then they should be rewarded, no question about it. I just think that that level of inequity is pretty high. And I'm not saying that, therefore, take all of his money and give it to those making $2 a day. There was something else about, was it infrastructure we were talking about in terms of, the separation between hard and soft infrastructure. What about healthcare facilities? Have we learned anything from the pandemic and the way it's been managed to better inform our decisions about healthcare? Was there any caffeine in that coffee? I think.
We haven't talked about international affairs.
Good point. International.
International.
What are the key international topics today?
Well, we have too many areas in the world where there are dictator governments. Which are holding down their people. Good for you.
I was reading your mind.
Good for you. And as opposed to this, for instance, in Syria, we've got the whole world saying that the current regime there is being bad. But we've got Russia, who wants to maintain their port in the Mediterranean. So they don't care what's happening to the people as long as they keep their port. How can, we don't want to go to war with Russia. So that's just one illustration of a problem that we have in international affairs and trying to get people, regimes, to act in a more civilized manner.
You know, the question of improving world governance is one that has been so unsuccessfully addressed so often over the last century and a half, and probably longer ago than that. But you think about the end of World War I and the desire to have a world without war, a world with equity. And the League of Nations went nowhere. We ended World War II with two things that had all the promise in the world, and most of us were around to see that, especially over the decades in the end of the 40s, the 50s, and the early 60s, is the United Nations on one hand and the World Bank and the other financial institutions on the other were had so much promise. And the idea that we could finally get together and, among other things, prevent these renegade regimes from running roughshod over their populations. What's happened to that? And is it that there are too many countries in the United Nations and that the voting rights there have changed so much? The UN seems powerless to do anything about Syria or Myanmar. My goodness gracious, what the Buddhists are doing there is just tragic. Are we toothless at the international level? Does anybody here have experience in that field that could talk about that? Or opinions? Experience is not necessary.
Useless.
I'm sorry?
They're useless.
They're useless, but they need they be? I guess that's the question. Is there not some way that, because the last thing I can imagine any of us want to do is go to war with China over Taiwan, go to war with Russia over Syria or Russia over Ukraine. Right there, we allowed that to happen, and everybody, wrung their hands and said, "What are we're going to do about Crimea?" No, we did nothing, basically. The sanctions haven't had effect. Now, Bill Ross, I think I saw Bill come in. I mentioned once that I thought we should focus less on sanctions, which seem to be useless. But I used Cuba as the example. And Bill, you said you strongly opposed that. That was one of the. I think your argument was that's one of the few tools the State Department has. Let's not throw it away. It may not be as effective as we'd like it to be, but you throw that away, what's left? Certainly, we're not running around with large pots of money to give to countries to do what we want them to do. And when we did have money to do that, we gave money to countries who supported our military intervention as a rule. What's left to be done? And that's on the side of international bodies. The international financial institutions have been weakened, in part because the countries who contribute to their resources have cut back on our support. I say ours because we're one of those countries, but the Europeans as well. One more.
About the United Nations. The veto power has caused it to be ineffective. When you've got 4 nations or whatever can veto any action of the United Nations, it's not going to be effective.
Well, I agree with that. And it seems that's been true since it was founded. I mean, the Security Council had the veto power from day one. The actions, though, of so many of the agencies of the UN achieved, I thought anyway, so much good over the years. And it seems to me that's less so today. Or it's less effective in situations like Syria. But again, the problem in Syria, if it weren't for Russia and its veto power, Syria wouldn't be a problem. Who's vetoing UN action in Myanmar? Why aren't we doing something about that? And I guess China has veto power, so there's no reason to talk about the Uyghurs or Taiwan. What about, what was this? I was reading just the other day about, the idea of universal vaccine passports. Any views on that? How many of you plan to travel sometime in the next year? And would you feel more comfortable if you knew that everybody who traveled alongside you or in the same plane or ship have shown their passports to get on the ship? But some states have now passed laws against that already, and there are questions about the federal government. Neil?
I would like to go back to the healthcare issue that you raised a few minutes ago. We passed right over it. When World War II ended, to go back into history, we went into a fee-for-service system without connection to results. And that has given us a healthcare system that is privatized, that is bureaucratic, not too much government intervention is helpful. If you look at the examples in Europe, the successful healthcare systems are government-run, and you can get much better health care in many of the civilized, not necessarily the countries that have no economic support. And it's not something I think we can ever reverse. But when you want some good health care, you go to Australia, you go to New Zealand, you go to other places in the world, and you can go in there and you can get it for free, practically speaking. And our healthcare system is bureaucratic as you can possibly imagine. That's all.
I suspect the idea of mandatory public health care would have some disagreement in this room.
No.
No, I think.
Doctor?
Well, I've had the privilege of working in London a couple of different times in my career, and I found their healthcare system to be much
services that we would never expect to get, like free ambulances, and their general practitioners keep amazing track of all their patients, and they have access to all the specialists in the country. I was so impressed at an early age with socialized medicine that I didn't see why in the world we didn't have something more close akin to it.
Back here, back,
I
John.
just wanted to add to that, they do have private medicine also. They're separate from public health care and.
For those who choose. John, behind it, Jeannie.
I worked in the healthcare industry and used to get together with doctors in UK. And they had two systems. They had the private system and the government system. In university, they were telling us the private system worked. The government system was less effective. Long waiting lists, times to get treated and that sort of thing. The unfortunate thing is the private sector costs more money. And so in that sense it was different. But there were two systems.
Jeannie, do you want to add that? Right behind me.
Having lived in Britain for 9 years, we had access to both the socialized medicine and to the private medicine. And for the most part, the socialized medicine was marvelous in terms of individual physicians. They were there all the time. They made house calls, and they did wonderful things. However, almost everything was called optional surgery. And to get optional surgery, you had to be on your deathbed. And people would have gallbladder problems and be in agony for years. And they would wait and wait and wait. I had this friend whose son was born with undescended testicles. And she was told that was fine, everything would be okay, but he'd have to have surgery before he was about 7 or 8 years old. Otherwise, the testicles would be harmed by the warmth of the body. And she tried to get it for him when he was 5, when he was 6. And finally, when he was 7, she said, if I cut Ashley's throat and he has to go in to save his life, will you do the testicles at the same time? And would you believe he was in that week?
For about half this audience, that's a very important issue. My only experience with this was in Croatia a couple years ago. I fell off a bicycle at the beginning of a ride down the Dalmatian coast. And each day I followed in a van. I followed the peloton because my sons were there. Each day I had to check into a new hospital to have I lost all the skin on my arms and legs, had all the bandages changed. It cost me $4 each day. Each day I walked into a hospital with English-speaking, this is in Croatia, this wasn't a wealthy country at all, English-speaking nurses and doctors. The facilities were not elaborate, but they were clean. I came away just amazed and enthralled by the experience. It's a really big topic, and one we should devote a whole day to. It's now 11 o'clock, so we're going to bring this to an end. But the topics that we're left without having solved completely, which I think is important for us to do each time we talk. We haven't solved the tax system, infrastructure, education, healthcare, just to start. We'll do that next week. Thank you all. Oh, and by the way, Parvez Ahmed is coming next week. It was my mistake that he didn't. Secondly, it was my mistake that many of you didn't receive materials for his speech. Now that doesn't matter, because I was trying to clean up my contact list and ended up eliminating 35 of you. Tragically, not by party. But I'll see you next week.